History is not just about dates and laws. Sometimes it's about a decision so bold that it reshapes an entire nation. Between 1920 and 1933, the United States tried to do the unthinkable. It attempted to outlaw alcohol completely. What followed was not sobriety, but chaos. Not order, but organized crime. Not morality, but violence, corruption, and rebellion. This is the story of the American Prohibition Era. A time when hidden doors led to speakeasies, when jazz played behind locked windows, and when criminals became kings. A time when men like Al Capone rose not because the law was weak, but because the law created opportunity. A time when ordinary citizens quietly became lawbreakers, and the government discovered the limits of its own power. In this history, you will hear how a moral movement turned into a national experiment, how cities like Chicago became battlefields, how the Gangster era was born, and how America ultimately admitted its mistake. This is not just a story about alcohol. It is a story about control, freedom, and unintended consequences. You're watching History Teller YT, where history is not rushed, simplified, or sugar-coated. If you listen carefully, you won't just learn what happened. You'll understand why it happened and why it still matters today. So settle in. This is the rise, the fall, and the legacy of Prohibition in the United States. Before Prohibition ever became law, alcohol was deeply woven into everyday American life in ways that are hard to imagine today. Drinking was not just a recreational habit, but a social ritual, a business, and in many cases a cultural inheritance passed down through generations. In cities and small towns alike, saloons serve as community centers where men gathered after long workdays. Immigrants found familiarity in a new country, and political discussions happened as often as drinking itself. Beer halls run by German Americans, Irish pubs filled with dock workers, and refined hotel bars serving whiskey to businessmen all existed openly and legally. Alcohol was everywhere, and for many Americans, it symbolized personal freedom rather than moral danger. At the same time, the United States was undergoing rapid industrial growth. Factories demanded long hours, dangerous labor, and physical endurance. For working-class Americans, alcohol became a form of relief, a brief escape from exhausting routines and economic pressure. Employers often tolerated drinking, and in some industries, it was even expected. This normalization of alcohol consumption made the idea of banning it seem unrealistic to many citizens, especially in urban centers where nightlife and entertainment thrived. However, this widespread drinking culture also had a darker side. Alcohol abuse contributed to domestic violence, workplace accidents, and public disorder. Many families suffered as wages were spent at saloons instead of on food or rent. Women and children often bore the consequences of uncontrolled drinking, and these experiences planted the seeds of resentment that would later fuel the temperance movement. What some saw as freedom, others saw as social decay. This growing divide between cultural acceptance and moral concern will become one of the central tensions leading toward Prohibition. The temperance movement did not appear overnight. It grew slowly over the 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by religious groups, social reformers, and especially women who had witnessed firsthand the damage alcohol could cause within families. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union argued that alcohol was the root cause of poverty, crime, and moral decline. Their message was simple but powerful. Remove alcohol, and society would heal. Churches across the country echoed these beliefs, framing sobriety as a moral duty and drinking as a sin that weakened the nation. By the early 1900s, the temperance movement had evolved from a social campaign into a political force. Groups such as the Anti-Saloon League became highly organized, well-funded, and strategically aggressive. They did not ask people to drink less. They demanded complete elimination of alcohol. These groups understood the power of legislation and targeted lawmakers relentlessly. Politicians who opposed them were publicly shamed or voted out of office. Slowly, state by state, dry laws began to appear, banning alcohol at local and regional levels. World War I further strengthened the temperance cause. Anti-German sentiment made beer closely associated with German immigrants an easy target. Grain shortages during wartime allowed reformers to argue that alcohol production wasted valuable resources needed for food. Patriotic language was used to link sobriety with loyalty to the nation. By the end of the war, the temperance movement had gained enough influence to push for a nationwide solution. What once seemed impossible now felt inevitable. As political pressure increased, the idea of a constitutional amendment banning alcohol moved from the margins to the center of national debate. Supporters argued that prohibition would reduce crime, strengthen families, and improve worker productivity. Many politicians, eager to appear morally upright and responsive to voters, publicly embraced these claims. Behind closed doors, some doubted whether such a sweeping ban could ever be enforced, but few were willing to stand against the growing tide. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, officially banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The Volstead Act followed, defining what counted as illegal alcohol and outlining enforcement mechanisms. On paper, the law appeared clear and firm. In reality, it underestimated the American appetite for alcohol and overestimated the government's ability to control it. The law criminalized a behavior that millions of citizens had practiced openly for generations. As the nation approached January 1920, reactions were mixed. Dry supporters celebrated what they believed was a moral victory and a turning point in American history. Others quietly prepared to ignore the law altogether. Brewers, distillers, bartenders, and saloon owners faced economic ruin. Some shut down. Others began to look for illegal alternatives. Unintentionally, the government had created a massive black market waiting to be filled. The stage was now set. Prohibition was about to begin, not as a peaceful reform, but as a social experiment that would reshape crime, politics, and American culture. What followed would give rise to speakeasies, bootleggers, and legendary figures like Al Capone. The Gangster era was not born from chaos alone, but from law itself. When Prohibition officially went into effect in January 1920, the federal government believed it had achieved a historic moral victory. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines announcing the end of alcohol in America. Churches rang bells. Temperance leaders celebrated publicly, and politicians gave speeches promising a cleaner, safer nation. On paper, the law seemed airtight. Breweries were shut down, distilleries were sealed, and saloons were ordered to close their doors. To supporters of Prohibition, this moment represented progress, discipline, and national self-control. Reality, however, moved in a very different direction. Almost immediately, it became clear that the government had dramatically underestimated how deeply alcohol consumption was embedded in American life. Millions of citizens had stocked up on liquor before the ban began, filling basements, attics, and hidden rooms with bottles of whiskey and wine. Doctors began writing prescriptions for medicinal alcohol, exploiting a legal loophole that allowed pharmacies to sell liquor for health reasons. Religious exemptions permitted wine for communion, which some churches quietly expanded beyond traditional limits. Law enforcement agencies were unprepared for the scale of the challenge. The federal government assigned too few agents to enforce prohibition across an entire nation. Many of these agents were poorly paid, inexperienced, and easily corrupted. In cities especially, police officers often looked the other way or actively participated in illegal alcohol distribution. The law existed, but enforcement was inconsistent, selective, and deeply flawed. Instead of eliminating drinking, prohibition pushed it underground, where it quickly became more profitable and more dangerous. As legal bars disappeared, illegal ones emerged almost overnight. These secret establishments, soon known as speakeasies, became the heart of underground nightlife. Hidden behind unmarked doors, inside basements, or disguised as soda shops and restaurants, speakeasies thrived in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. Entry often required a password or connection, but once inside, patrons found alcohol flowing freely. Jazz music filled the rooms, dancers crowded the floors, and a sense of rebellion hung in the air. Speakeasies were not limited to criminals or social outcasts. Middle-class professionals, politicians, artists, and even police officers frequented them. Drinking illegally became fashionable, especially among younger Americans who saw prohibition as outdated and hypocritical. Women, who had once been excluded from saloon culture, now drank openly in speakeasies, marking a significant shift in social norms. The underground drinking scene became a symbol of modernity, defiance, and cultural change. This new culture blurred moral boundaries. The same people who publicly supported prohibition often drank privately. The law created a shared secret between citizens and criminals, eroding respect for authority. Breaking the law no longer felt shameful, it felt normal. Organized networks developed to supply speakeasies with alcohol, and competition among suppliers quickly turned aggressive. What had begun as a moral reform was now actively reshaping American attitudes toward law, crime, and personal freedom. Supplying illegal alcohol required organization, risk, and violence, and this opened the door for a new class of criminals. Bootleggers emerged as the backbone of the prohibition economy. Some smuggled liquor from Canada across frozen rivers. Others imported rum from the Caribbean or produced homemade alcohol in hidden distilleries. Rural areas became centers for moonshine production, while cities acted as distribution hubs. The profits were enormous, far exceeding anything legal alcohol sales had ever generated. Criminal gangs quickly realized that controlling alcohol supply meant controlling territory. They fought over smuggling routes, warehouses, and speakeasy contracts. Violence escalated as rival groups used intimidation, bribery, and murder to protect their operations. Firearms became tools of business, and loyalty was enforced through fear. This was the beginning of organized crime as a structured, corporate-like system, complete with hierarchies, accountants, and enforcers. The government's attempt to eliminate alcohol had unintentionally created the most lucrative criminal market in American history. Ordinary criminals became wealthy businessmen overnight. Police corruption spread as officers accepted bribes to ignore shipments or tip off gangs about raids. Judges were influenced, politicians were funded, and entire neighborhoods were controlled by criminal organizations. Prohibition did not reduce crime. It professionalized it. By the early 1920s, it was clear that America was no longer just enforcing a controversial law. It was living inside its consequences. The groundwork had been laid for figures who would soon become infamous. Men who understood that prohibition was not a barrier, but an opportunity. Among them was a rising power in Chicago whose name would soon become legendary: Al Capone. In the early 1920s, Chicago stood at a crossroads of geography, industry, and corruption that made it uniquely vulnerable to the effects of Prohibition. The city was a transportation hub, surrounded by railroads, highways, and waterways that connected it to the rest of the country and to international smuggling routes. It had a massive working-class population, deep political corruption, and a long history of organized vice. When alcohol was outlawed, Chicago did not resist quietly. It adapted aggressively. Neighborhoods were already divided along ethnic and political lines, with Irish, Italian, Jewish, and other immigrant communities forming tight social networks. These networks became ideal foundations for criminal organizations. Local gangs that once focused on gambling or small-scale extortion suddenly found themselves sitting on a gold mine. Alcohol demand in Chicago was enormous, and the city's size made enforcement nearly impossible. Federal agents were outnumbered, underpaid, and often compromised before they even started their jobs. City officials were no better. Many politicians publicly supported Prohibition while privately accepting bribes from bootleggers. Police departments were riddled with corruption, and loyalty often lay with the highest bidder rather than the law. In this environment, criminal groups did not simply operate in the shadows. They operated openly, confidently, and with political protection. Chicago was no longer just a city breaking the law. It was a city reorganizing itself around it. Before Al Capone became the face of Prohibition-era crime, there was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was not flashy, loud, or reckless. He was strategic, disciplined, and intelligent. He understood that Prohibition had turned alcohol into a business. And like any business, it required structure, efficiency, and negotiation. Torrio believed violence should be used sparingly, only when necessary to protect profits or territory. Under Torrio's leadership, Chicago's criminal operations became centralized. He worked to eliminate chaotic street-level fighting by absorbing smaller gangs or forcing them into submission through intimidation rather than constant bloodshed. Torrio emphasized bribery over bullets, ensuring police officers, judges, and politicians were on the payroll. This approach allowed operations to run smoothly while minimizing public attention. Torrio also recognized the importance of reliable personnel. He surrounded himself with loyal associates who understood discipline and secrecy. One of these associates was a young man from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. Capone was aggressive, ambitious, and fiercely loyal. Torrio saw potential in him, not just as an enforcer, but as a future leader. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned how organized crime could function like a corporation rather than a street gang. These lessons would shape the future of Chicago's underworld. Despite Torrio's preference for order, Chicago could not avoid violence. Rival gangs, particularly those controlling the city's north side, refused to surrender territory or profits. These groups also wanted control of speakeasies, breweries, and distribution routes. As competition intensified, shootings, bombings, and assassinations became more frequent. Streets that once hosted ordinary businesses now echoed with gunfire. The public grew accustomed to violence as a part of city life. Newspapers reported gang killings with alarming regularity, often placing them alongside sports scores or weather updates. Many citizens viewed the violence with a mix of fear and fascination. Gangsters were criminals, but they were also celebrities. Their wealth, power, and defiance of the law captured the public imagination, especially during a time of rapid social change. In 1925, an assassination attempt nearly killed Johnny Torrio. He survived, but the message was clear. The war for Chicago was escalating beyond control. Torrio chose to step away from leadership, believing the cost of continued conflict was too high. Before leaving, he handed control to Al Capone. This transfer marked a turning point. Torrio had built the machine. Capone was about to unleash it. Chicago was now poised to become the symbol of Prohibition-era crime, and Al Capone was about to step fully into the spotlight. His rise would redefine the relationship between crime, media, and power in America. Alphonse Al Capone did not emerge from nowhere. His rise was shaped by violence, loyalty, and the harsh realities of immigrant life in early 20th century America. Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents, Capone grew up surrounded by poverty and street gangs. Formal education ended early for him, but street education began immediately. He learned how power worked in neighborhoods where respect was earned through fear and reputation. By his teenage years, Capone was already involved in criminal activity, working for gangs that controlled gambling, protection rackets, and illegal bars. Capone's move to Chicago was not accidental. Johnny Torrio recognized Capone's potential and brought him west to work in a city exploding with criminal opportunity. Chicago offered scale, money, and political vulnerability that New York could not match. Under Torrio's supervision, Capone learned how to manage people, money, and violence. He was not just a brute. He understood logistics, supply chains, and the importance of public image. Capone paid his men well, demanded loyalty, and punished betrayal without hesitation. When Torrio stepped aside after surviving an assassination attempt, Capone inherited an empire that was already powerful but still unstable. Unlike Torrio, Capone embraced visibility. He dressed well, spoke to reporters, and cultivated an image of confidence and control. To many citizens, he appeared more like a successful businessman than a criminal. This public presence, combined with ruthless enforcement behind the scenes, allowed Capone to consolidate power rapidly. Chicago was no longer just a battlefield of gangs. It was becoming Capone's territory. Once in control, Capone transformed bootlegging into a structured enterprise. Breweries were rebuilt in secret. Distribution routes were secured with armed guards. Speakeasies were franchised across neighborhoods, each paying a percentage of profits back to the organization. Every operation was calculated, tracked, and protected. Capone understood that chaos threatened profits, so he enforced strict internal discipline. Violence was targeted, not random. Rivals were eliminated strategically rather than impulsively. Capone's organization extended beyond alcohol. Gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering all fell under his control. Through bribery, Capone ensured cooperation from police, judges, and city officials. Entire precincts were effectively on his payroll. This corruption allowed his empire to operate with near impunity. Raids were delayed or redirected. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed stories. The law existed, but it rarely reached Capone directly. What made Capone especially dangerous was his understanding of public relations. He donated money to charities, funded soup kitchens during hard times, and presented himself as a provider for the community. Many working-class citizens viewed him as a protector rather than a predator. He filled gaps left by ineffective government institutions. This support made it harder for authorities to act decisively against him without public backlash. By the mid-1920s, Capone was earning millions of dollars annually. His organization employed thousands directly and indirectly. Prohibition had not just created criminals. It had created corporations built on illegality, and Capone was their most visible executive. Despite his careful planning, Capone could not avoid violence. Rival gangs, particularly those on Chicago's north side, continued to challenge his dominance. Control of alcohol distribution meant control of enormous wealth, and no territory was surrendered without a fight. Shootings became frequent, and bombings targeted businesses that refused to cooperate. The city lived under constant tension, with violence spilling into public spaces. The most infamous example of this brutality would come later, but even before that, Capone's reign was marked by bloodshed. Assassinations were carried out in broad daylight. Innocent bystanders were sometimes caught in the crossfire. Each act of violence strengthened Capone's grip, while simultaneously increasing public fear and outrage. Newspapers sensationalized the killings, turning gang warfare into daily entertainment. This violence exposed the fundamental contradiction of Prohibition. A law intended to reduce crime had created an environment where murder became a tool of business. Capone did not hide from this reality. He accepted it as the cost of maintaining power. Yet the more visible and violent his empire became, the more pressure mounted on federal authorities to respond. Capone was untouchable at the local level, but his growing notoriety was drawing attention from Washington. By the late 1920s, Al Capone was no longer just a criminal leader. He was a symbol of Prohibition's failure. His rise forced the nation to confront an uncomfortable truth. The law had empowered the very forces it was meant to destroy. By the mid-1920s, it was no longer possible to pretend that Prohibition was working. Across the United States, ordinary citizens were quietly but consistently defying the law. Drinking had not disappeared. It had simply changed locations. Alcohol was now consumed behind closed doors, in private clubs, basements, hotel rooms, and hidden bars that blended seamlessly into city life. What made this defiance remarkable was how widespread it became. This was not a rebellion limited to criminals or social outcasts. Teachers, lawyers, factory workers, doctors, and politicians all participated. Many Americans justified their behavior by pointing to the hypocrisy surrounding enforcement. Laws were applied unevenly, often targeting the poor while leaving the wealthy untouched. If a person had money or connections, access to alcohol was rarely a problem. This inequality weakened respect for the law itself. People began to see Prohibition not as a moral rule, but as an arbitrary restriction imposed by distant lawmakers who did not understand daily life. Breaking the law became normalized, even casual. Homemade alcohol production exploded during this period. Families brewed beer in bathtubs and fermented wine in closets. Moonshine operations thrived in rural areas, where geography and local loyalty protected producers from federal agents. Recipes were shared quietly between neighbors. What had once been a regulated industry was now a patchwork of personal experiments, some safe, others deadly. Poison alcohol caused illness and death, further exposing the dangers of unregulated production. Instead of uniting Americans under a shared moral standard, Prohibition divided them into those who enforced the law and those who ignored it. The majority fell into the second group. This silent defiance reshaped American identity. Citizens who had once trusted the law now questioned its legitimacy. Prohibition was no longer just about alcohol. It was about the relationship between the government and the people it governed. One of the most unexpected consequences of Prohibition was the transformation of social behavior, particularly among women and young people. Before the ban, public drinking spaces were largely male-dominated. Prohibition erased these boundaries. Speakeasies became mixed-gender spaces where women drank, smoked, danced, and socialized openly. This shift reflected broader cultural changes already underway, including women's suffrage and new ideas about independence and identity. Young Americans embraced illegal drinking as a symbol of rebellion. Jazz clubs, dance halls, and underground parties became cultural hubs. Music grew louder, fashion more daring, and social norms looser. Drinking was no longer just about alcohol. It became part of a lifestyle that rejected tradition and authority. For many young people, Prohibition made alcohol more appealing, not less. The law gave drinking an edge, a sense of excitement that legal consumption never had. Parents and reformers watched these changes with alarm. Instead of producing a disciplined, sober generation, Prohibition seemed to accelerate moral experimentation. The very groups temperance advocates claimed to protect were now openly challenging social rules. The cultural gap between generations widened and resentment grew. The law had failed to shape behavior, but it had succeeded in shaping attitudes, often in ways its supporters never intended. This cultural shift also influenced media. Films, literature, and popular music began to romanticize criminals, nightlife, and rebellion. Gangsters were portrayed as powerful figures living outside conventional limits. This fascination fed into the growing celebrity of figures like Al Capone. Crime became entertainment, and entertainment softened public outrage. Prohibition was losing the cultural battle as much as the legal one. As evidence of failure mounted, federal authorities faced increasing pressure to act. Prohibition agents attempted raids, seizures, and arrests, but their efforts were often symbolic rather than effective. For every operation shut down, several more replaced it. Smuggling networks adapted quickly, changing routes and methods with ease. Criminal organizations had money, manpower, and insider information. The government struggled to keep up. Attempts to strengthen enforcement revealed deeper problems. Corruption within law enforcement undermined investigations. Some agents accepted bribes. Others feared retaliation. Witnesses were reluctant to testify. Courts were overwhelmed with cases and often dismissed charges due to lack of evidence or procedural errors. The justice system itself was strained by the sheer volume of violations. Federal frustration grew, particularly as violence increased in major cities. Gang wars made headlines and embarrassed government officials. International observers criticized the United States for creating a law that fueled organized crime. Within political circles, quiet discussions began about whether prohibition had been a mistake. Publicly, few leaders were willing to admit failure. Privately, doubts were spreading. By the late 1920s, prohibition had reached a critical point. The law remained in place, but belief in it was fading. Criminal empires were stronger than ever. Citizens were openly cynical. The question was no longer whether prohibition could succeed, but how long the nation would continue pretending that it already had. By the late 1920s, gang violence was no longer confined to back alleys or whispered rumors. It had become a public spectacle that unfolded in full view of American cities. Shootings happened in busy neighborhoods, outside restaurants, and near offices during daylight hours. Bombings destroyed buildings and terrified entire blocks. The sounds of gunfire and explosions became familiar, especially in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Violence was no longer shocking. It was expected. This escalation was driven by competition. Prohibition had turned alcohol into a product worth killing for. Control of breweries, warehouses, transportation routes, and speakeasies meant financial dominance. When negotiations failed, violence followed. Gang leaders authorized hits with cold calculation, knowing that eliminating a rival could secure millions in future profits. These killings were business decisions, not emotional reactions. The press played a powerful role in shaping public perception. Newspapers covered gang wars obsessively, publishing graphic details and dramatic headlines. Photographs of crime scenes appeared on front pages. Gangsters were named, described, and analyzed like celebrities. This coverage increased fear, but also fascination. The public followed gang conflicts the way they followed sports rivalries. Each killing raised questions about retaliation, alliances, and the next move. Law enforcement struggled to respond effectively. Police departments were overwhelmed and often compromised. Some officers actively worked for gangs. Others feared retaliation against their families. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The result was a cycle of violence with little accountability. Gang warfare exposed the weakness of the legal system and made it clear that Prohibition had created a criminal environment beyond local control. The most infamous moment of Prohibition-era violence came on February 14th, 1929, in Chicago. On that morning, 7 men associated with the North Side Gang were lined up against a wall inside a garage and executed by gunmen disguised as police officers. The attackers used machine guns, firing dozens of rounds at close range. The brutality of the killings shocked the nation. Photographs of the bodies spread rapidly through newspapers, leaving little to the imagination. Although Al Capone was in Florida at the time, few doubted who had ordered the massacre. The attack was designed to eliminate rival leadership and send a message of dominance. Instead, it marked a turning point. Public tolerance for gang violence collapsed almost overnight. The massacre stripped away any remaining illusion that organized crime could be controlled or ignored. What had once been viewed as an underground problem was now a national disgrace. Politicians who had previously avoided the issue were forced to respond. Congressional hearings intensified. Federal agencies came under pressure to act decisively. The massacre also shifted public opinion about figures like Capone. His image as a charming outlaw gave way to that of a ruthless killer. Charity donations and public appearances could no longer offset the reality of mass murder. The St. Valentine's Day massacre did not end gang violence, but it changed its meaning. It became proof that Prohibition had empowered criminals to commit atrocities with near impunity. The massacre symbolized the failure of the law more clearly than any statistic ever could. From that moment forward, the federal government could no longer afford inaction. After years of hesitation, federal authorities began to shift strategy. Rather than relying solely on local enforcement, Washington took a more direct role. The Treasury Department expanded its efforts against bootlegging networks. New investigative units were formed, and agents were encouraged to pursue criminal leaders rather than street-level offenders. The focus moved from alcohol itself to the money and power structures behind it. This shift reflected a growing realization that Prohibition could not be enforced through traditional policing alone. Organized crime had become too sophisticated. Criminal leaders insulated themselves from direct involvement, relying on layers of subordinates. Arresting bartenders and drivers accomplished nothing. To dismantle these empires, the government needed new tactics, better coordination, and legal creativity. Public pressure supported this change. Citizens were tired of violence, corruption, and hypocrisy. Many no longer cared about the original moral goals of Prohibition. They wanted safety and order. Federal officials understood that restoring trust required visible action against figures like Capone. Quiet investigations began, targeting financial records, tax filings, and hidden assets. The war against organized crime was entering a new phase. It would no longer be fought only in the streets, but in courtrooms and government offices. The groundwork was being laid for the downfall of America's most powerful gangsters. Prohibition had created them, but now was forcing the government to evolve in order to stop them. By the end of the 1920s, it had become painfully obvious that traditional policing methods were no match for Prohibition-era organized crime. Local police forces were designed to handle robberies, assaults, and routine law enforcement, not nationwide criminal corporations fueled by millions of dollars in illegal profits. Gang leaders rarely carried alcohol themselves, rarely pulled triggers, and almost never left evidence behind. When violence occurred, witnesses vanished, testimonies collapsed, and juries were intimidated or bribed. Corruption further weakened enforcement. Many officers earned modest salaries while bootleggers offered envelopes of cash large enough to change lives. Some officers justified taking bribes by convincing themselves that prohibition was unjust anyway. Others simply feared retaliation. Entire police units were compromised, making coordinated action impossible. Raids were often leaked in advance, allowing criminals to move operations before agents arrived. This failure forced federal officials to rethink their approach. Arresting low-level offenders had no impact on criminal leadership. Speakeasies reopened days after raids. Bootlegging routes shifted overnight. The law was chasing shadows. What the government lacked was leverage, a way to reach men who appeared untouchable under existing statutes. The realization marked a turning point. If gangsters could not be defeated as bootleggers, perhaps they could be defeated as something else. This shift in thinking would redefine federal law enforcement and reshape the American justice system for decades to come. One of the most famous symbols of this new federal strategy was Elliot Ness, a young Treasury agent tasked with targeting Al Capone's operations in Chicago. Ness understood that corruption was the greatest obstacle to enforcement. His solution was radical for the time. He carefully selected a small team of agents with proven integrity and kept their identities secret. This group became known as the Untouchables, a name that reflected their refusal to accept bribes. Ness focused on disrupting Capone's infrastructure rather than trying to arrest Capone directly. His team raided breweries, destroyed equipment, and seized shipments, inflicting financial damage rather than seeking immediate convictions. These actions hurt Capone's profits and sent a message that federal enforcement was becoming more aggressive and less predictable. The media quickly turned Ness into a hero. Newspapers portrayed him as the embodiment of law and order standing against corruption. This publicity boosted public morale and restored some confidence in government authority. However, the reality was more complicated. While Ness caused real disruption, Capone's organization remained vast and adaptable. For every operation destroyed, others continued to function. Still, the Untouchables represented something new. They showed that organized crime could be challenged without compromise. They also demonstrated the importance of professionalism, discipline, and federal oversight. Even when arrests did not stick, the pressure increased. Capone and other gang leaders were no longer operating without resistance. The walls were beginning to close in. Perhaps the most important breakthrough in the fight against organized crime came from an unexpected direction: tax law. Federal investigators realized that while gang leaders avoided direct involvement in bootlegging, they could not hide their wealth entirely. Lavish homes, expensive cars, and extravagant lifestyles raise questions about income sources. If criminals refused to admit how they earned their money, they still had to explain how they spent it. The Internal Revenue Service began quietly building cases based on unpaid taxes. This strategy required patience and meticulous documentation. Investigators tracked bank records, expenditures, and witness statements. Unlike bootlegging charges, tax evasion did not rely on catching someone with alcohol in hand. It relied on financial proof, which was harder to intimidate or destroy. This approach was revolutionary. It shifted the battlefield from the streets to the courtroom. Criminals who had survived gunfights and bribed police officers found themselves vulnerable to accountants and paper trails. The law no longer needed to prove illegal alcohol sales. It only needed to prove dishonesty. For Al Capone, this strategy would prove fatal. While he mocked prohibition enforcement publicly, he underestimated the power of financial investigation. He believed his influence and intimidation would protect him. He was wrong. The government had finally found a weapon that matched the scale of the enemy. Prohibition had created organized crime, but it also forced the government to evolve. Federal law enforcement was becoming smarter, more coordinated, and more determined. The era of unchecked gangster power was nearing its end. By 1930, Al Capone was still one of the most powerful criminals in the United States, but the environment around him had changed dramatically. The days when local police could be bribed into silence were fading, at least at the federal level. Investigators from multiple agencies were now coordinating their efforts, quietly sharing information and building long-term cases. Capone noticed the pressure. Raids increased. Financial scrutiny intensified. His movements were tracked more closely than ever before. Despite this, Capone remained confident. He had survived years of gang wars, assassination attempts, and public scandals. He believed his wealth and influence made him immune. When questioned by reporters, he dismissed government efforts as harassment. He portrayed himself as a businessman unfairly targeted by politicians seeking publicity. Many of his supporters believed him. After all, he had evaded serious consequences for years. What Capone failed to fully grasp was the patience of federal investigators. They were no longer chasing headlines or dramatic arrests. They were building a quiet, methodical case centered on tax evasion. Accountants, clerks, and former associates were interviewed. Financial records were reconstructed piece by piece. Even when witnesses were reluctant, paper trails told their own story. This slow approach frustrated the public, but it was intentional. Investigators knew that one solid conviction would matter more than dozens of failed prosecutions. Capone's lifestyle, once a symbol of success, now worked against him. Every luxury purchase became potential evidence. The very excess that had defined his image was becoming his weakness. In 1931, the federal government finally moved. Al Capone was indicted on multiple counts of tax evasion. The charges shocked the public, not because they were severe, but because they were mundane. After years of murder, corruption, and bootlegging, Capone was being prosecuted for unpaid taxes. Some critics mocked the government for its choice. Others understood the brilliance of it. The trial drew massive attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. Spectators lined up outside. Capone entered confidently, smiling for cameras, still believing he could control the outcome. His legal team attempted familiar strategies, including jury manipulation. This time it failed. The judge replaced the jury at the last moment, preventing intimidation and bribery. Evidence was presented carefully and relentlessly. Prosecutors demonstrated that Capone had earned millions of dollars while claiming little to no income. Witnesses confirmed his spending habits. Records revealed a pattern of deliberate evasion. There was no dramatic confession, no emotional breakdown. The case rested on logic, numbers, and undeniable inconsistencies. When a verdict was delivered, it was decisive. Capone was found guilty on multiple counts. He was sentenced to prison, a severe blow to a man who had ruled Chicago from behind layers of protection. The conviction sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. If Capone could fall, no one was truly safe. Capone was initially sent to a federal prison in Atlanta, where he attempted to maintain influence through bribery and connections. When authorities realized this, they transferred him to Alcatraz, a remote island prison designed to isolate inmates completely. There, Capone was just another prisoner. His power, wealth, and reputation meant nothing behind bars. Prison life took a toll on him. Years of stress, excess, and untreated illness began to show. His health declined, both physically and mentally. The man who once commanded armies of gunmen now struggled with basic routines. By the time he was released in 1939, his criminal career was effectively over. He returned to Florida, a shadow of his former self. Capone's downfall marked more than the end of one man's empire. It symbolized a shift in how America confronted organized crime. The government had proven it could defeat powerful criminals without matching their violence. It had used law, patience, and persistence instead. Yet Capone's conviction did not solve the deeper problem. Organized crime did not disappear. Prohibition was still in place, and criminal networks continued to operate. Capone was gone, but the system that created him remained. His fall was a warning, not a resolution. The question now facing the nation was whether Prohibition itself could survive much longer. As the United States moved into the early 1930s, the weaknesses of Prohibition were no longer theoretical. They were economic, visible, and painful. When alcohol was outlawed, thousands of legal businesses vanished almost overnight. Breweries, distilleries, bars, trucking companies, glass manufacturers, and farms that supplied grain all collapsed or downsized. Entire industries that had once provided stable employment were erased. The government also lost a major source of tax revenue, money that had previously funded public services and infrastructure. This loss became especially damaging after the stock market crash of 1929. As the Great Depression deepened, unemployment soared and government budgets tightened. Citizens struggled to survive, while the federal government searched desperately for new revenue sources. At the same time, billions of dollars flowed through illegal alcohol markets, completely untaxed. Criminal organizations prospered while ordinary Americans suffered. This contrast fueled resentment and anger. Public faith in Prohibition eroded rapidly. Even people who had once supported the ban began to question its value. The promise that Prohibition would reduce crime and poverty had clearly failed. Instead, it had produced corruption, violence, and economic loss. The law seemed disconnected from reality, an ideological experiment carried out at the worst possible moment. Newspapers, economists, and political commentators openly criticized Prohibition. What had once been framed as a moral necessity was now discussed as a policy disaster. The nation was changing, and Prohibition increasingly felt like a relic of a different era, imposed without regard for consequence. As public opinion shifted, so did political calculations. Politicians who had once championed Prohibition began to distance themselves from it. Some claimed enforcement failures were the problem, not the law itself. Others quietly admitted repeal might be the only solution. What mattered most was survival. Voters were angry, unemployed, and impatient. State governments played a key role in this shift. Some states reduced enforcement or openly ignored federal pressure. Local officials argued that enforcing Prohibition drained resources better used elsewhere. Juries refused to convict. Judges handed down lighter sentences. The legal system itself was signaling resistance. At the national level, political parties began to fracture internally. The Democratic Party increasingly embraced repeal, framing it as a practical response to economic crisis. Republicans, once strongly associated with Prohibition, found themselves divided. The issue was no longer morality. It was governance. The idea of repeal gained legitimacy. Discussions moved from fringe conversations to serious legislative debate. Lawmakers began exploring how alcohol could be regulated safely rather than banned outright. The country was preparing for a dramatic reversal. something rare in constitutional history. After more than a decade of living under Prohibition, Americans were exhausted. The law had reshaped daily life, often in frustrating and contradictory ways. Citizens were tired of pretending not to see what everyone knew existed. Speakeasies were common knowledge. Bootleggers were local figures. Corruption was expected. This fatigue influenced culture deeply. Films portrayed gangsters as complex figures rather than simple villains. Navel se explode moral ambiguity. Humor emerged around Prohibition's absurdities. Satire replaced outrage. The law no longer inspired fear or respect. It inspired cynicism. What remained was a sense of collective disillusionment. Prohibition had promised improvement and delivered instability. It had asked Americans to sacrifice without convincing them the sacrifice mattered. By the early 1930s, the country was ready to move on. The question was no longer whether Prohibition had failed. It was how to end it without chaos. Repeal would not simply restore alcohol. It would redefine the relationship between law, morality, and personal freedom. The nation stood on the edge of another historic change. The Great Depression did what years of crime reports and moral debate could not. It forced the nation to confront Prohibition through the lens of survival. By the early 1930s, unemployment reached staggering levels. Families lost homes, savings disappeared, and breadlines stretched through city streets. In this climate, Prohibition felt less like a moral safeguard and more like an unnecessary burden. People were not asking whether alcohol was good or bad anymore. They were asking why the government was refusing a potential source of jobs and revenue. Economists began openly discussing what legal alcohol could mean for recovery. Reopening breweries and distilleries would create immediate employment. Regulating alcohol would allow taxation at a time when government budgets were collapsing. These arguments resonated with a population desperate for relief. The idea that criminals were making fortunes while the government collected nothing became deeply offensive to struggling citizens. Prohibition enforcement also consumed resources that many felt were better used elsewhere. Federal agents, court systems, and prisons were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, violent crime continued despite the ban. The promise that Prohibition would reduce social harm rang hollow when contrasted with economic desperation. The Depression reframed the entire debate. Prohibition was no longer discussed primarily as a moral issue. It was now a practical problem standing in the way of recovery. This shift in perspective laid the groundwork for repeal in a way no previous argument had managed to do. The 1932 presidential election became a turning point for Prohibition. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran on a platform that openly supported repeal. He did not frame it as surrender or failure. He framed it as realism. Roosevelt understood the national mood. Americans wanted solutions, not lectures. His position on Prohibition signaled a broader commitment to pragmatic governance. Roosevelt's victory sent a clear message. The electorate was ready for change. Shortly after taking office, his administration moved quickly. Congress proposed the 21st Amendment, designed to repeal the 18th Amendment. This approach was historic. Never before had a constitutional amendment been repealed by another amendment. The process itself reflected urgency and confidence. To avoid political resistance, the amendment was sent to state conventions rather than state legislatures. This strategy reduced the influence of entrenched Prohibition supporters and allowed public opinion to play a more direct role. State by state, conventions voted in favor of repeal. The momentum was undeniable. For many politicians, repeal offered a chance at redemption. Supporting the end of Prohibition allowed them to align with economic recovery and public demand. Opposition faded rapidly. What once seemed politically dangerous now seemed inevitable. The nation was preparing to close one of the most controversial chapters in its history. On December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, officially ending Prohibition. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Across the country, people gathered in bars, restaurants, and homes to mark the moment. Legal alcohol returned after 13 years of absence. Breweries reopened. Glasses were raised not just in celebration, but in relief. The end of Prohibition did not erase the damage it had caused. Organized crime remained powerful. Corruption did not vanish overnight, but repeal marked an acknowledgement of reality. The government admitted that banning alcohol had failed and that regulation was a better approach. This admission restored some trust between citizens and the state. States were given authority to regulate alcohol as they saw fit. Some remained dry. Others moved quickly to license businesses and collect taxes. The system was imperfect, but it was functional. For the first time in over a decade, alcohol was no longer a symbol of defiance. Prohibition ended quietly, without violence or collapse. That quiet ending contrasted sharply with the chaos it had produced. It left behind lessons about lawmaking, enforcement, and unintended consequences. The era was over, but its influence would continue to shape American attitudes toward crime, government power, and personal freedom for generations. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, the return of legal alcohol did not happen overnight or without complication. The industry that reemerged was not the same one that had existed before 1920. Many breweries and distilleries were gone forever, destroyed by years of shutdown, neglect, or conversion to other uses. Equipment had rusted, skilled workers had moved on, and capital was scarce in a nation still struggling through the Great Depression. Rebuilding required time, investment, and regulation. The federal government approached alcohol cautiously. Rather than returning to the loose standards of the pre-Prohibition era, lawmakers created a regulatory framework designed to control production, distribution, and sales. Licensing systems were introduced. Taxes were imposed at multiple levels. Advertising was restricted. These measures were meant to prevent the excesses that temperance advocates had once pointed to as justification for prohibition. Alcohol was legal again, but it was no longer unchecked. For many Americans, the reopening of breweries and bars symbolized stability returning to daily life. Jobs were created quickly, especially in manufacturing, transportation, and hospitality. Tax revenue flowed into government coffers, funding public works and social programs. The contrast with the Prohibition years was stark. Legal businesses replaced criminal networks as the primary suppliers of alcohol. Still, the transition was uneven. Some communities remained dry by choice, reflecting lingering moral opposition. Others embraced alcohol enthusiastically. The nation had not reached a single conclusion about drinking, but it had agreed on one thing. Banning it entirely had not worked. Regulation, not prohibition, was the new approach. Although prohibition ended, organized crime did not disappear with it. Criminal networks that had grown powerful during the 1920s were not simply dismantled. They adapted. Many shifted focus to gambling, labor racketeering, prostitution, and later narcotics. The skills developed during Prohibition, bribery, violence, logistics, and secrecy remained useful. The era had permanently professionalized American organized crime. Some gangsters attempted to go legitimate, investing in legal businesses using money earned during Prohibition. Others continued operating in illegal markets, now less visible but still profitable. The myth that repeal would instantly eliminate crime was quickly proven false. Prohibition had created structures that could not be undone easily. Law enforcement also changed. Federal agencies were stronger, more experienced, and more coordinated than they had been in 1920. Lessons learned from fighting bootlegging influenced future approaches to crime. Financial investigation, interstate cooperation, and long-term surveillance became standard tools. The government was no longer as naive. The relationship between crime and the state had been permanently altered. Prohibition showed that criminal power could grow when laws ignored human behavior. That lesson would echo in future debates over drugs and other regulated substances. As years passed, prohibition became a subject of reflection rather than immediate controversy. Americans looked back on the era with a mix of embarrassment, fascination, and curiosity. Films, books, and radio programs revisited the gangsters, speakeasies, and corruption of the 1920s. The period was romanticized, dramatized, and sometimes misunderstood. Yet beneath the mythology, serious lessons remained. Prohibition exposed the limits of moral legislation. It showed that laws disconnected from public consent could erode respect for government itself. Millions of Americans had become lawbreakers not because they were criminals, but because the law felt unreasonable. That experience left a lasting mark on national identity. The era also reshaped ideas about personal freedom and government authority. Americans emerged more skeptical, more questioning, and more aware of unintended consequences. Prohibition had aimed to improve society, but instead revealed its complexity. By the mid-20th century, prohibition was widely regarded as a cautionary tale. It was no longer debated as policy, but studied as history. Its legacy lived on not in the absence of alcohol, but in the lessons it taught about power, culture, and the unpredictable nature of reform. One of the most lasting effects of the Prohibition era was how deeply it transformed American law enforcement. Before 1920, most policing was local and reactive. Departments focused on visible crimes and immediate threats. Prohibition changed that model completely. Enforcing a nationwide ban on alcohol required coordination across cities, states, and borders. It forced the federal government to expand its reach and authority in ways that had never been attempted before. During Prohibition, agencies learned hard lessons about intelligence gathering, surveillance, undercover work, and interagency cooperation. Investigators discovered that organized crime could not be dismantled through arrests alone. They needed patience, planning, and legal innovation. Financial records became as important as eyewitness testimony. Long-term investigations replaced quick raids. These methods, developed out of necessity, became permanent features of American policing. The era also revealed the dangers of corruption and the importance of accountability. Prohibition showed how easily underpaid officers could be compromised and how damaging that corruption could become. In response, professional standards slowly improved. Training increased. Federal oversight expanded. While problems remained, the system that emerged after Prohibition was more structured and more aware of its own vulnerabilities. In this sense, Prohibition acted as a harsh teacher. It exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. The modern American law enforcement system, with all its strengths and flaws, owes much of its shape to the challenges created during those 13 turbulent years. Although Prohibition officially targeted alcohol, its legacy strongly influenced how the United States later approached other substances. Lawmakers remembered both the ambition and the failure of the alcohol ban. When concerns about drugs like marijuana, cocaine, and heroin grew in the decades that followed, Prohibition served as a reference point, sometimes as a warning and sometimes as justification. Some policymakers believed Prohibition had failed because alcohol was too culturally accepted. They argued that other substances could still be banned successfully. Others saw prohibition as proof that banning demand-driven products would inevitably create black markets and empower criminals. These competing interpretations shaped drug policy throughout the 20th century. The language of moral reform returned repeatedly. So did the promise that strict enforcement would protect society. At the same time, the fear of organized crime loomed large. Prohibition had shown how quickly illegal markets could grow. Despite this knowledge, the lessons were not always applied consistently. History did not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymed. Public skepticism toward prohibition-style policies can be traced directly to the alcohol ban. Many Americans remembered how easily good intentions had produced chaos. That memory influenced debates, court decisions, and public opinion long after the last speakeasy closed. By the mid-20th century, prohibition had become a standard subject in American classrooms. It was taught not just as a sequence of dates and laws, but as a case study in unintended consequences. Students learned how reform movements gain power, how political momentum can override practical concerns, and how laws can reshape society in unexpected ways. Historians approach prohibition with increasing nuance. Early accounts often focused on gangsters and violence. Later scholarship examined class conflict, gender roles, immigration, and regional differences. Prohibition was no longer seen as a simple mistake, but as a complex reflection of American values at a particular moment in time. Popular culture played a major role in shaping memory. Films and novels emphasized drama and glamour, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. Gangsters became icons. Speakeasies became symbols of rebellion. While this storytelling kept the era alive, it also risked oversimplifying its lessons. Still, Prohibition endured as one of the most studied periods in U.S. history. It reminded Americans that laws do not operate in isolation. They interact with culture, economics, and human behavior. That awareness became part of the nation's historical consciousness, influencing how future reforms were imagined and judged. While history often remembers Prohibition through gangsters and politicians, its deepest impact was felt in ordinary communities. Working-class neighborhoods were forced into difficult choices. Alcohol had been part of social life for generations, tied to celebrations, grief, and routine relaxation. When it was suddenly outlawed, people did not simply abandon it. Instead, communities adapted in ways that blurred the line between survival and criminality. In many areas, local bootleggers were not outsiders. They were neighbors, cousins, or friends. Buying illegal alcohol often felt less like a crime and more like supporting someone within the community. This familiarity made enforcement emotionally complicated. Calling the police meant betraying people you knew. Many chose silence instead. This dynamic weakened trust in law enforcement and strengthened informal networks that operated outside the law. Prohibition also strained relationships between citizens and government. Laws were meant to protect, but this one felt imposed and disconnected from lived reality. When enforcement targeted specific neighborhoods while ignoring others, resentment grew. Immigrant communities, already facing discrimination, felt singled out. Prohibition reinforced a sense that the law was not neutral, but selective. Over time, this tension reshaped civic life. Respect for authority declined. Cooperation with police decreased. The damage went beyond alcohol. It affected how communities viewed rules, fairness, and accountability. Prohibition asked people to choose between legality and loyalty. Many chose loyalty. One of the most tragic consequences of Prohibition was its impact on public health. With alcohol driven underground, quality control disappeared. Legal distilleries had once followed standards. Illegal producers did not. Bootleg alcohol was often diluted, contaminated, or dangerously improvised. Poisonings became common. Thousands of Americans were hospitalized or killed by tainted liquor. The federal government worsened the situation by ordering industrial alcohol to be deliberately poisoned to discourage illegal consumption. This policy backfired. Bootleggers attempted to remove toxins, but often failed. The result was widespread illness and death among drinkers who had no idea what they were consuming. Prohibition had turned a regulated product into a lethal gamble. Medical professionals were caught in an ethical bind. Alcohol prescriptions were legal, and doctors faced pressure to issue them liberally. Some complied out of sympathy. Others profited. The line between medical care and exploitation blurred. Pharmacies became alcohol distributors in everything but name. These health consequences undermined moral arguments for prohibition. A law intended to protect families was now killing people. Newspapers published stories of blindness, paralysis, and death. Public sympathy shifted decisively. The cost of prohibition was no longer abstract. It was measured in lives. Inside homes, prohibition produced quieter, less visible suffering. Families were divided over compliance. Some parents tried to enforce sobriety while their children drank secretly. Others drank together, normalizing illegality within the household. This contradiction created confusion and tension, especially for younger generations learning what the law meant. For families affected by alcoholism, prohibition did not deliver relief. Addiction did not vanish. It became harder to treat and easier to hide. Shame increased as drinking became criminalized. Seeking help risked exposure. Support systems weakened, not strengthened. The criminalization of alcohol also brought legal consequences into family life. Arrest for minor violations could mean jail time, lost income, and social stigma. A single charge could derail a household already struggling economically. These penalties often fell hardest on the poor, reinforcing inequality. Prohibition's human cost was rarely visible in speeches or statistics. It lived in strained relationships, quiet illnesses, and unspoken compromises. By the time repeal arrived, many Americans were emotionally exhausted. They did not celebrate because alcohol returned. They celebrated because an experiment that had disrupted daily life was finally over. During the Prohibition era, the American media played a powerful role in shaping how the public understood crime and criminals. Newspapers were the dominant source of information, and competition for readers was intense. Editors quickly realized that gangsters sold papers. Stories about bootleggers, shootouts, and corruption were dramatic, violent, and personal. They had clear villains, recognizable names, and ongoing narratives. Crime reporting became serialized entertainment. Gang leaders were covered in detail. Their clothing, habits, relationships, and rivalries were described as carefully as those of movie stars. This attention elevated criminals into public figures. Readers followed their movements, speculated about their next actions, and debated their motives. Violence was condemned, but fascination was unavoidable. The press turned prohibition into a daily drama unfolding in real time. This coverage had consequences. Constant attention made criminals more famous and, in some cases, more powerful. Public notoriety helped intimidate rivals and witnesses. It also shaped public opinion about law enforcement. Failures were amplified, successes scrutinized. The government appeared slow and ineffective by comparison. At the same time, media exposure reflected genuine public confusion. Americans were trying to make sense of a law that criminalized familiar behavior while empowering violent figures. Newspapers did not create that contradiction, but they made it impossible to ignore. Prohibition became not just a legal issue, but a national story told every morning at breakfast tables. As film grew into a dominant cultural force, Hollywood began drawing inspiration from Prohibition-era crime. Early gangster films portrayed bootleggers as ambitious, clever, and defiant. These characters often rose from poverty, challenged corrupt systems, and lived by their own rules. While their stories usually ended in punishment, the journey was thrilling. Audiences were captivated. These films reflected real tensions. Many Americans admired success, even when it came from illegal paths. During the Depression, the idea of rising against a broken system held emotional appeal. Gangsters on screen represented power in a powerless time. They wore fine suits, commanded respect, and controlled their fate. This image contrasted sharply with the daily struggles of ordinary citizens. Critics worried that such portrayals glamorized crime. Reformers argued that Hollywood was undermining moral values. In response, studios emphasized consequences, ensuring criminals paid for their actions by the final act. Still, the impact was lasting. The gangster became an American archetype, shaped by Prohibition but extending far beyond it. This romantic image complicated public understanding of the era. Real gangsters were violent, exploitative, and destructive. Yet popular culture softened these realities. Prohibition crime entered the national imagination not just as history, but as legend. Over time, the line between reality and myth blurred. Speakeasies were remembered as glamorous lounges rather than dangerous, illegal spaces. Gangsters were remembered for their style more than their brutality. Prohibition itself was often reduced to colorful anecdotes rather than systemic failure. This selective memory mattered. It shaped how future generations understood the past and how they approached similar issues. By focusing on excitement and rebellion, popular narratives sometimes overlooked suffering, corruption, and loss. The human cost faded behind dramatic imagery. Historians have worked to correct this imbalance, emphasizing complexity over spectacle. They remind us that Prohibition was not a movie, but a lived experience for millions. It disrupted communities, empowered criminals, and strained democratic institutions. Still, myth persists because it speaks to deeper truths about American culture. The fascination with defiance, ambition, and individualism did not begin with Prohibition, nor did it end there. The era amplified those traits and left behind stories that continue to resonate. Understanding Prohibition requires separating myth from reality without dismissing either. The legends reveal what Americans wanted to believe. The history reveals what actually happened. Together, they explain why Prohibition remains one of the most compelling and instructive chapters in U.S. history. One of the deepest questions raised by Prohibition was not about alcohol, but about the nature of law itself. For the first time in American history, a constitutional amendment attempted to control a personal behavior practiced by millions of ordinary citizens. This placed the government in direct conflict with daily life. The result was not obedience, but negotiation, avoidance, and resistance. Americans learned that law did not automatically command respect simply because it existed. This realization altered how people thought about authority. Prohibition exposed the limits of moral legislation when it lacked broad public support. Citizens who had never considered themselves criminals became lawbreakers overnight. This blurred moral boundaries. If a law felt unreasonable, many believed it did not deserve compliance. That belief did not vanish with repeal. It became part of the national mindset. The era also revealed how enforcement choices reflect power. Wealthy Americans drank quietly and safely, while poorer communities faced raids, arrests, and violence. This uneven application deepened skepticism about fairness. Prohibition did not just fail to eliminate drinking. It challenged the idea that the law treated everyone equally. In the years that followed, lawmakers became more cautious about sweeping bans. Prohibition served as proof that authority must align with culture to function effectively. The American relationship with law became more pragmatic and more suspicious. Obedience was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. Prohibition intensified traits already present in American identity. Individualism, resistance to control, and distrust of centralized authority all surfaced clearly during the era. Drinking illegally became a quiet act of rebellion, a way to assert personal choice against government interference. This attitude crossed class, gender, and regional lines. For many Americans, breaking prohibition laws did not feel immoral. It felt practical. This separation between legality and morality had long-term consequences. Citizens became more comfortable judging laws by their outcomes rather than their intentions. If a law produced harm, people felt justified ignoring it. Prohibition also reinforced the idea that Americans value freedom of choice, even when choices carry risk. Rather than eliminating alcohol-related problems, the ban convinced many that personal responsibility worked better than government control. That belief would resurface repeatedly in later policy debates. The cultural memory of prohibition strengthened a national narrative that celebrates resistance to overreach. While this narrative can oversimplify complex issues, it remains powerful. The era helped define what Americans believed about themselves. They saw a nation unwilling to surrender everyday freedoms, even under constitutional pressure. The influence of prohibition extended far beyond its repeal. Policymakers, activists, and citizens carried its lessons into future debates about regulation and reform. The central question became familiar. How far should the government go in shaping personal behavior, and at what cost? Prohibition showed that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. It demonstrated how quickly laws can produce unintended consequences when they ignore social reality. Organized crime, corruption, and public cynicism were not planned results, but they became defining features of the era. These lessons influenced how Americans approached later reforms. Even when similar strategies were attempted, prohibition remained the comparison point. Supporters and critics alike invoked it as either a warning or a justification. In this way, prohibition became more than history. It became a reference, a shared memory that shaped national conversation. Its failure did not end reform efforts, but it forced a more careful examination of how change is imposed. The American identity that emerged from prohibition was more cautious, more skeptical, and more aware of complexity. The era left scars, but it also left insight. That insight continues to shape how the nation understands freedom, responsibility, and the power of law. In America's major cities, prohibition reshaped daily life with speed and intensity. Urban centers had dense populations, diverse immigrant communities, and thriving nightlife before the ban. When alcohol became illegal, these same factors made cities ideal environments for underground markets. Demand remained high, anonymity was easier, and enforcement was stretched thin. Cities did not slow down under prohibition. They adapted. Speakeasies multiplied rapidly in urban neighborhoods. Some were hidden behind storefronts. Others operated openly behind trusted doors. In cities like New York and Chicago, entire entertainment districts functioned illegally yet efficiently. Musicians, waitstaff, bartenders, and suppliers all depended on underground alcohol for income. Prohibition did not suppress nightlife. It pushed it into a parallel economy. Urban political machines also played a role. City governments were often deeply corrupt, with long-standing relationships between politicians, police, and criminal groups. Prohibition fit easily into these systems. Alcohol became another commodity controlled through favors, bribes, and influence. Enforcement varied block by block, depending on who paid and who did not. For city residents, prohibition felt distant and artificial. The law existed, but life continued much as before, only with added secrecy. This experience shaped urban attitudes toward government authority. Cities emerged from prohibition more skeptical, more hardened, and more accustomed to navigating around restrictive laws. In rural America, prohibition took on a very different character. Many rural communities had long traditions of homemade alcohol production. Moonshine was not new. It was a practical response to isolation, limited access to markets, and cultural custom. Prohibition criminalized these traditions, turning farmers and craftsmen into outlaws. Geography protected rural producers. Hills, forests, and back roads made detection difficult. Communities often protected their own, warning producers of approaching agents or refusing to cooperate with authorities. Loyalty mattered more than legality. In some areas, federal agents were seen as outsiders imposing unwanted rules. Moonshine production became both an economic necessity and a cultural statement. During hard times, selling homemade alcohol provided income when few alternatives existed. Prohibition enforcement threatened livelihoods, not morals. This deepened resentment toward the federal government and reinforced regional identity. Violence occurred in rural areas too, but it was different from urban gang warfare. Conflicts were personal, local, and tied to territory rather than empires. Prohibition intensified these tensions, but it did not create them. It amplified existing divides between rural independence and federal authority. The South and Midwest occupied a complicated position during Prohibition. Many states in these regions had supported temperance long before the national ban. Churches were influential, and alcohol was often viewed as a moral threat. Yet even in these areas, reality was inconsistent. Public support for prohibition did not always translate into private behavior. Drinking continued quietly, often within homes or trusted circles. Enforcement depended heavily on local officials, who sometimes sympathized with neighbors more than federal law. The result was selective enforcement that mirrored social relationships. In the Midwest, industrial cities and rural farming communities existed side by side, producing contrasting experiences. One town might enforce prohibition strictly while the next ignored it entirely. This patchwork reality undermined the idea of a unified national policy. These regional differences mattered. They revealed how difficult it was to impose a single moral standard on a diverse nation. Prohibition assumed uniform values. America proved otherwise. The law fractured along regional lines, exposing cultural divisions that had always existed. When Prohibition ended, these regions responded differently. Some welcomed repeal, others resisted, but all have been changed. The experience reinforced the idea that national laws must account for local realities. Prohibition failed in part because it ignored that truth. Women played a central role in the rise of prohibition, long before the law ever took effect. In the 19th century, alcohol abuse was closely tied to domestic hardship. Men controlled household income, and excessive drinking often meant unpaid rent, hunger, and violence at home. For many women, especially those with limited legal or economic power, Temperance was not an abstract moral idea. It was a survival strategy. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union framed alcohol as the enemy of family stability. Their activism combined moral language with social reform. They organized marches, petitioned lawmakers, and used churches as platforms to spread their message. These women were politically active before they even had the right to vote. Prohibition became one of the few ways they could influence public policy directly. This activism helped legitimize the temperance movement. It was harder to dismiss prohibition as extreme when it was presented as protection for women and children. By the time the 18th Amendment was ratified, women reformers felt they had achieved a historic victory. They believed the law would transform society for the better. However, this success also carried unintended consequences. The law they helped create produced violence, corruption, and suffering that many never anticipated. For some women, the realization was deeply painful. Prohibition had been meant to shield families. Instead, it exposed them to new dangers. Once prohibition was in place, women's roles shifted in unexpected ways. Speakeasies became social spaces where women drank openly, danced freely, and claimed visibility in public nightlife. This marked a dramatic break from pre-prohibition norms, where respectable women were largely excluded from bars and saloons. Some women worked in speakeasies as singers, servers, or managers. Others ran bootlegging operations or acted as intermediaries. Prohibition opened economic opportunities that were illegal but lucrative. For women facing limited options, these roles offered independence and income. At the same time, cultural attitudes were changing. The image of the flapper symbolized freedom, defiance, and modern identity. Drinking became part of that image. What temperance leaders had once condemned as dangerous behavior was now embraced by younger women as empowerment. This contradiction revealed how deeply prohibition misread social momentum. A law driven by older moral frameworks collided with a society already moving toward greater personal freedom. Women were no longer united around sobriety. They were divided by generation, class, and experience. When prohibition ended, many women reevaluated their relationship to reform movements. The failure of the alcohol ban forced difficult questions. Could moral goals justify harmful outcomes? Could laws truly change behavior without public consent? Women remained politically active, but their strategies evolved. Rather than focusing on absolute bans, reformers increasingly emphasized education, healthcare, and economic support. The lesson of prohibition was clear. Control imposed from above often backfired. The era also left women with a stronger public voice. Their activism during temperance and prohibition had proven their political power. That influence did not disappear with repeal. It shifted toward other causes, including labor rights, public health, and social welfare. Prohibition reshaped women's relationship with authority and reform. It showed both the potential and the limits of moral legislation. Women entered the modern era more politically engaged, but also more cautious. They had seen firsthand how good intentions could unravel. This legacy remains part of Prohibition's story. The era was not only about crime and alcohol. It was about who held power, who defined morality, and who bore the consequences when ideals collided with reality. One of the most lasting structural effects of Prohibition was the expansion of federal authority inside everyday American life. Before 1920, the federal government played a relatively limited role in policing personal behavior. Most law enforcement was local or state-based. Prohibition changed that balance dramatically. Enforcing a national ban on alcohol required federal agents, federal courts, federal prisons, and federal funding on an unprecedented scale. The government created new bureaucracies and expanded existing ones. The Treasury Department gained significant enforcement responsibilities. Federal agents were deployed across the country, often operating in communities that had little previous contact with federal law enforcement. This presence altered how Americans experience government. Authority felt closer, more intrusive, and more visible. This expansion was controversial. Supporters argued that national problems required national solutions. Critics warned that prohibition set a dangerous precedent by allowing the federal government to regulate personal habits. These concerns did not disappear after repeal. They influenced later debates about federal power, states' rights, and individual liberty. Prohibition demonstrated that once government power expands, it rarely contracts completely. Even after repeal, the federal infrastructure built to enforce the ban did not vanish. It was repurposed. The modern regulatory state, with its reach into economic and social life, was shaped in part by the demands of prohibition enforcement. The legal system was deeply tested by prohibition. Courts were overwhelmed with cases involving alcohol violations. Judges were forced to interpret new laws that often lacked clarity. Questions about search and seizure, entrapment, and due process became common. Prohibition accelerated legal debates that would shape constitutional law for decades. Law enforcement frequently pushed boundaries. Warrantless searches, aggressive raids, and questionable surveillance methods became more common. In response, courts began defining limits. Some rulings strengthened civil liberties. Others expanded government authority. The balance between security and freedom was renegotiated in real time. These legal battles mattered far beyond alcohol. They influenced how courts approached future enforcement issues, including drugs, labor disputes, and national security. Prohibition acted as a stress test for American law. It revealed how fragile rights could be under pressure and how important judicial oversight was in maintaining balance. The era also professionalized prosecution. Prosecutors learned to build complex cases using financial evidence, witness cooperation, and long-term strategy. These techniques became standard practice. The legal system emerged more sophisticated, but also more aware of its power. From a policy perspective, prohibition became a case study in unintended consequences. It showed how laws driven by moral certainty could ignore practical realities. Policymakers learned, sometimes painfully, that enforcement capacity matters as much as intent. A law unenforceable at scale risks undermining respect for all law. Prohibition also highlighted the importance of public consent. Without it, even constitutional amendments can fail in practice. Citizens must see laws as legitimate, not merely legal. When that legitimacy collapses, compliance follows. These lessons influenced future governance. While not always applied consistently, prohibition became a reference point in policy debates. Lawmakers asked whether proposed regulations might create black markets or empower criminal networks. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they did not. The modern American state was shaped by prohibition's failures as much as its ambitions. The era left behind institutions, legal precedents, and cautionary lessons. It reminded the nation that governing a diverse society requires humility, flexibility, and respect for human behavior. Prohibition did not just change drinking. It changed how America governed itself. As decades passed after repeal, prohibition slowly shifted from a living political memory into a subject of historical analysis. What had once been a divisive national battle became material for textbooks, documentaries, and academic debate. Historians no longer argued about whether prohibition should exist. They asked why it happened, how it failed, and what it revealed about American society. Scholars examined the social forces that drove the temperance movement, including religion, gender politics, immigration anxiety, and class conflict. Prohibition was no longer framed as a simple mistake, but as the product of real fears and genuine reform efforts. This broader perspective added complexity to the narrative. The people who supported Prohibition were not villains. They were responding to real social problems, even if their solution proved disastrous. At the same time, historians emphasize scale. Rarely had a single law reshaped crime, politics, culture, and public trust so quickly. Prohibition became a benchmark for understanding policy failure. It was studied alongside other large-scale reforms to illustrate how power, culture, and enforcement interact. In classrooms, Prohibition often served as an introduction to critical thinking about history. Students were encouraged to consider unintended consequences and to question simplistic explanations. The era became a lesson in humility, reminding future generations that certainty can be dangerous when it ignores complexity. Outside academia, Prohibition lived on in popular memory through stories rather than analysis. Speakeasies, jazz clubs, and gangsters dominated the narrative. The era was remembered as stylish, rebellious, and dramatic. This nostalgia was shaped by films, novels, and later television, which emphasized excitement over hardship. This selective storytelling softened the reality of the period. The fear, corruption, and everyday suffering faded into the background. What remained were images of flappers dancing, secret passwords at hidden doors, and sharply dressed gangsters outsmarting the law. These images were appealing because they turned chaos into entertainment. Nostalgia also reflected distance. As those who lived through Prohibition passed away, memory became less personal and more symbolic. The era was no longer something to be endured. It was something to be imagined. This allowed romantic interpretations to flourish. Yet even this nostalgia carried meaning. It reflected America's complicated relationship with rebellion and authority. Prohibition stories allowed people to explore defiance without confronting its real costs. The past became a safe place to examine rule-breaking. Despite romanticization, Prohibition retained its role as a warning. Politicians, journalists, and activists continued to reference it when debating new policies. The phrase, "another prohibition," became shorthand for fear of unintended consequences. The era stood as evidence that banning popular behavior could strengthen criminal networks and weaken public trust. This reference was not always accurate or fair, but it was powerful. Prohibition became part of the national vocabulary, a symbol of overreach and miscalculation. Even when invoked loosely, it reminded Americans that laws must align with reality. At the same time, Prohibition also served as proof that the nation could correct itself. Repeal showed that constitutional mistakes were not permanent. This aspect of the story mattered. It reinforced faith in democratic adjustment, even after failure. By the late 20th century, Prohibition occupied a unique place in American memory. It was both embarrassment and lesson, spectacle and warning. It represented ambition without restraint and reform without foresight. Understanding how Prohibition is remembered helps explain why it still matters. The era is not just history. It is a mirror reflecting how Americans think about power, freedom, and the cost of certainty. When historians ask whether Prohibition failed, the answer often depends on how failure is defined. If the goal was to eliminate alcohol consumption, then Prohibition clearly failed. Americans continued to drink throughout the era, often in greater quantities and under more dangerous conditions. If the goal was to reduce crime, the outcome was the opposite. Organized crime expanded, violence escalated, and corruption spread through institutions meant to uphold the law. Yet Prohibition did succeed in one unexpected way. It revealed the true limits of law in a democratic society. It exposed how deeply culture, habit, and personal choice shape behavior. The amendment forced a national confrontation between idealism and reality. That confrontation was painful, but instructive. Prohibition showed that laws cannot function in isolation from public consent. Even constitutional authority could not override everyday practice when millions disagreed with the rule itself. This was a sobering realization for a nation that believed strongly in the power of legislation to shape morality. In that sense, Prohibition did not simply fail. It educated the country. It clarified what government could and could not control. It forced Americans to reconsider how reform should be pursued and at what cost. The experience left behind caution where certainty once existed. The Gangster era did not emerge from moral decay alone. It was created by opportunity. Prohibition transformed alcohol into the most profitable illegal commodity of its time. That transformation attracted ambitious, ruthless individuals who understood how to exploit demand. Figures like Al Capone were not anomalies. They were logical outcomes of a policy that criminalized a widely desired product. This understanding reframes the narrative. Organized crime during Prohibition was not just about criminals being evil. It was about incentives. When legal supply disappeared, illegal supply filled the gap. Violence followed because the law provided no peaceful mechanism to resolve disputes. The state unintentionally outsourced alcohol distribution to criminals. This lesson has echoed through later history. Whenever a popular product is banned without eliminating demand, black markets emerge. Prohibition made that dynamic visible on a national scale. It taught Americans that crime often flourishes not in spite of law, but because of poorly designed law. The Gangster era remains compelling because it feels dramatic and extreme. But beneath the drama lies a structural truth. Policy choices shape behavior. Prohibition shaped behavior towards secrecy, corruption, and violence. When a policy changed, so did the behavior. Today, Prohibition stands as one of the most important experiments in American governance. It is remembered not because it lasted long, but because it revealed so much. It exposed divisions between urban and rural America, between generations, between ideals and lived experience. It tested the Constitution and forced its own reversal. Few periods show the full chain of cause and effect as clearly. Moral reform led to constitutional change. Constitutional change led to criminal empires. Criminal empires led to violence and corruption. Violence and corruption led to public rejection. Public rejection led to repeal. That sequence is why Prohibition still matters. It offers a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. It shows that power must be exercised with humility. It reminds lawmakers that society is not a machine that responds predictably to force. The American Prohibition era was not just about alcohol. It was about control, resistance, adaptation, and consequence. It reshaped law enforcement, politics, culture, and national identity. Its legacy lives on in how Americans debate freedom, morality, and the reach of government. In the end, Prohibition left behind a simple but powerful lesson. When law ignores human nature does not disappear. It adapts, and sometimes it fights back. Today, you heard the full journey of the American Prohibition era. You heard how a nation tried to enforce morality through law, and how that law reshaped crime, culture, politics, and everyday life. You saw how banning alcohol did not eliminate drinking, but instead pushed it into the shadows. How those shadows gave birth to speakeasies, bootleggers, and organized crime. How gangsters rose, governments adapted, and public trust slowly collapsed. You also saw the deeper lesson. Prohibition was not just a failed law. It was a warning. It showed that when laws ignore human behavior, they often create the very problems they are meant to solve. It taught America that control without consent leads to resistance, that morality cannot be enforced by force alone, and that power must be used with humility. The end of Prohibition was not just the return of alcohol. It was the return of realism. It was the moment a nation chose regulation over denial, learning from its own mistakes. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, remember that every era has stories like this. Stories where decisions change lives, where power meets consequence, and where history leaves behind lessons meant to be remembered. This is History Teller YT. And if you want more stories like this, more real history told with depth and honesty, make sure to come back. There's always another chapter waiting to be told. Until then, keep questioning, keep listening, and keep history alive.